Hello, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. 50% of Canada's Indigenous youth don't graduate high school. Most agree the education system is broken, but what's the best way to fix it? So I love doing stories from Canada. They always give us so much insight into what Canada is like. Our digital producer Malika Bilal is here looking out for your live feedback.
Thanks,
what are you getting from Canadian netizens?
There is a lot of feedback. Now we're looking at some very striking statistics, and so our community has lots to say about it, of course. And there's also some strong criticism of this new education reform proposal.
Right.
On Twitter, Adrian writes in, "I've no faith that anything from a colonial source," he says, "especially in education, has any purpose but assimilation." Strong word there, Indigenous control, he goes on to say. Now that's one person's view. Of course, we want to hear from you at home as well. So tweet us your questions and your comments throughout the program with hashtag AJStream.
And Twitter isn't the only way to keep up with the stream. Have you liked us on Facebook yet? Quite a few people have, but we can always have space for more. There you see, 165,000. Facebook is also a great platform to share your thoughts on upcoming stories, pitch your ideas, and tell us what's making news in your part of the world.
Hi, I'm Julian. I'm a blogger on the Huffington Post and Cambridge PhD student, and I'm in the stream.
Half of Canada's Indigenous students don't make it through school. The government has a solution: the First Nations Education Reform Act. Aboriginal Affairs Minister Bernard Valcourt has called the bill transformational and has opened it up for discussion. But First Nations communities are up in arms, saying that they were not consulted on the Act and it doesn't reflect their culture, nor does it address the problem of inadequate school funding. One Aboriginal chief called the plan paternalistic and colonialist. Despite the differences, the bill is likely to pass and be implemented in September 2014. So what's the best way forward for Indigenous communities in Canada? Joining us to talk about this, we have Caroline Krause. She's a retired Aboriginal education consultant. In our Google Plus Hangout, Canadian journalist Richard Landau. He supports the government of Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Tyrone McNeil is president of the First Nations Education Steering Committee. From Montreal, we have educator and blogger Chelsea Val, and Nigan Sinclair is a professor of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. It's great to have all of you here in the stream. But let's start the conversation though with Caroline. Caroline, if you look at the education system for Aboriginal communities in Canada, what's gone wrong? Do you see problems?
Oh yes, very definitely. I had the honor and the privilege of being part of a national First Nations education panel that traveled across the country and that visited many communities, fly-in communities, met with parents, students, elders, and chiefs. This took place in 2011, 2012. And so we had a chance to see firsthand what the issues were and to ask the people to please give us solutions. And what we see going forward is that we really need a First Nation Education Act. And I fully support the Harper government's initiative. There are problems with the legislation, but I believe that if we come together and work together, that we can resolve those problems.
So as you were traveling around, what did you see? What did you see? And understand that this is why so many young Aboriginal students are failing at school.
Yes, because the number one problem from the teacher point of view is attendance. And if the school programs are not meeting the needs of the children, then that will create a situation where they will not come to school. That was a huge problem. There were some schools that were beautifully done and very well equipped. There were many other schools that really appeared to be underfunded, even new schools. Sometimes they would have a beautiful new school, but there would be no books in the library, a beautiful new gym, there would be no equipment in the gym. So there are lots of issues that need to be addressed, and I do believe that can be addressed if we just come together, work together on this issue. Because my panel was actually a joint effort on the part of the Assembly of First Nations and the Government of Canada, and that was historic in itself.
Tyrone, is this a school system that you recognize? Are you seeing the same issues that Caroline is seeing?
Well, first of all, that we're different all across the country. In BC, we have an education system that really doesn't compare to what it is that Caroline is raising, because we have all of our schools collaborating under a single association. We have my board, First Nations Education Steering Committee, responsible for all things education. So we have really strong aggregation and collaboration. But most importantly, we have depth and capacity. So when we see issues like what Carolyn's raising, we're able to address it, or at least address it the best we can, given the funding circumstances coming from the federal government.
So it's really important to say that in British... Go ahead, Caroline.
Yes, I just want to follow up to say that FNESC and the First Nations School Association in BC, they are a shining example of what can happen when people come together, because they are having great success with their students. And also the other group that I want to mention are the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. And those two groups on either side of the country have, developed their own system, and they have separate legislation that cover them. But my concern is for the children, all of the other children, many of the other children who do not have that protection and whose rights are not enshrined in legislation to protect them and to guarantee them quality education.
Nigan, I'd like you to pick up on something that Caroline mentioned in one of her responses. She says there are problems with the legislation, and that's echoed here online. Katie writes in that one of those problems is that there's not accurate consultation with Aboriginal leaders. She says if only one side insists consultation was adequate, then consultation probably wasn't adequate. What are your thoughts on that, Nigan?
I think that that's really evident within the Act itself. I mean, this Act is supposed to be the centerpiece of the federal government's new interest in Indigenous education, because the government's only interest in Indigenous people to this point is how much land they can extract and resources they can extract as quick as possible using the most forceful means, which we saw a week and a half ago in Elsie Booktook in New Brunswick. Interestingly, with the Mi'kmaq people, when they stand up for land, they are pepper sprayed, but when they are used for shining examples of education, I think that's very indicative of this federal government. So consultation, they would claim, is from 2011. However, I was at the consultation hearings here in Manitoba, and the consultation hearings were pretty much the same way that most things are done with Indigenous peoples by this federal government, which is a dictation, a reading off a piece of paper, and then a few little questions and answers where really nothing is written down, and then move on to the next community. Unfortunately, this Education Act is going to involve essentially the Minister of Indian Affairs becoming the superintendent of all Indigenous schooling, further bureaucracy which First Nations will then pay for. And currently within Canada, we see that First Nations children are 2/3 funded. Their funding is 2/3 what every other Canadian student is received within the country. That is inadequate funding. Not only does that indicate what Caroline discusses of empty libraries, problematic resources, but also the real lack of support for teachers and adequately trained teachers to go up and be supported in these northern communities, because actually one of the biggest problems is not only curriculum and the long-standing problems within Indigenous communities of receiving this inherently biased and political curriculum that celebrates a certain notion of Canada, but then also the idea that teachers constantly are leaving, constantly moving in and out of these communities, and that that results in a quite atrophied sense of education.
Nigan,
and
I want you to
take
a breath for a moment, because I can tell this is a subject that is very close to your heart. You're very passionate. I just need you to just slow down a little bit so the rest of us can keep up with you. But we spoke to Bernard Vercoeur, who's the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, and he gave us a very long statement, and some of it I'm going to share with you. So listen to this first part. He says, our government firmly believes that all First Nation students across Canada deserve access to a school system that meets provincial and territorial standards while respecting First Nation culture, language, rights and treaties. This sounds incredibly reasonable, Nigan. What am I not seeing here? What's the subtext?
I think what you're seeing is the delivery of a First Nations Education Act, where the minister then has absolute and total control over every aspect of a community, down to the hiring of teachers, the delivery of curriculum, and then down to what actually is not dealt with at all is the radical problem in funding that goes both from the primary and secondary all the way through every grade in schools, up into the cap that's on post-secondary funding for First Nations, which was assured under the treaties that Indigenous students would be adequately resourced and supported in order for this country to be settled.
So,
I have to say though, while I understand that point of view, government has given funding to before, and this government's looking for results. It's a conservative government. Basically, what it's looking for is for people to become self-reliant, because that's a centerpiece to conservative philosophy, conservative strategy. So obviously, that's what they want. I think there's probably a two-step process that needs to be looked at here. Number one, you can't give people money and say, go run a bunch of schools if they've never run schools before, and if they have inadequate teachers. It's just not going to work. That's destined to fail. So there'll be two steps to the process, it seems to me. One is that you provide the means whereby a community can run its schools, such as they've succeeded in Nova Scotia and in British Columbia, and then you can move on to the next step. It seems to me like a two-step process.
But look at how it is we got here, though. The system here in BC, we're accountable to the local parents, we're accountable to the community. This proposed act takes all of that away, and we're accountable to the minister. When the minister says there's a lack of an education system across the country, that in fact is true, because the only system that's out there on the national level is the federal government system. And that's all about accountability and reporting. So and it can't be about that.
Tyrone,
I would agree that a homogenous approach is not going to work when you have the many nations we have that are Aboriginal nations in Canada, and they vary from nation to nation. I would agree.
So I should say that we have 600 different nations in Canada,
Absolutely.
at least 600.
Yes.
So trying to get a school system that works for everybody, that is a challenge just by itself.
Good luck.
So, so Tyrone, here's an issue here. So I'm looking at the Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development for Canada. There's a big document out here, and it says it's part of a consultation process. Now, if what you're doing in British Columbia is going so well, let's tell our audience how many of your students typically pass through high school, just so that they know that you're bucking the trend here.
Well, first of all, out of the 130 schools on reserve in BC, about 75% don't go up to grade 12. So, but the overall numbers for graduation rate now is about 57-58%.
Okay, so you're doing better than the average for most of the other Aboriginal communities in Canada. So if you're part of this consultation process, then maybe you can help it. Do you feel that you're part of that conversation?
Actually, no. And I was going to comment, when you read out that message from the minister, quite often the messaging that we get from the federal government is actually polar opposite to what it is they're doing in terms of policy or regulation, or in this case, statute. The federal government has a fiduciary obligation to properly consult with all First Nations across the country. There's 203 individual First Nations in the province of British Columbia, and the federal government came and spent 1 day of 6 hours with us, including about 200 people.
And
so
what did they do in that 1 day?
All they did was spewed out their rhetoric. They're supposed to be there to respond to questions, but they didn't respond to any. So we actually followed up after that session, asking for specific responses from specific questions, and all we got back was gobbledygook. Nothing's changed.
May I jump in at this point?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, so I think, and we're talking about two consultation processes that took place. First of all, the First Nation Education Panel, the joint undertaking by the AFN and the Government of Canada, that took place in 2011-2012. This was a huge undertaking, a huge engagement activity, and we did more than just, meet an hour or so with people and not write down anything. We had copious notes from every meeting. We met with students, we met with all kinds of groups. We actually had 2 consultation processes, 2 roundtable processes in BC, and only 1 in most of the other places.
So Caroline, why has Tyrone felt that you only had a day?
Nest was part of that. You hosted us, and we really, and I remember that when you had the blanket ceremony for us, you said to us, your job is to listen. And we did listen, and we drafted a beautiful document entitled Nurturing the Learning Spirit of First Nation Students. And in that, we came up with 5 recommendations, which is what the government had asked us to do. They asked us to come up with recommendations that they could act on, because, my belief is that they were very sincere in wanting to address the problem of under-education, that exists across the country. And we went across the country. We did exactly the same thing, except we had only one round table in the other areas, but we had extensive meetings, individual meetings with all of the stakeholders. This took, I was involved for 1 year. The committee itself it was formed in June of 2011.
All right, Caroline, so I hear from your perspective that there's an awful lot of work put in from your perspective. Caroline, I'm going to move things on a little bit because there's so much to talk about, and our community also want to talk as well and join in the conversation. Malika.
Well, Caroline mentioned the stakeholders, and I'm actually hearing from them and seeing their comments online. A lot of them are focusing on something that we just mentioned, which is the funding, but haven't really dug into it. So Linda on Facebook says, equitable funding for education resources that are culturally appropriate and owned and managed by First Nations is the answer. She goes on to say, we have the no. We survived for thousands of years before contact in these lands. And Chelsea, on those same lines, there's a video comment here about funding. I'd like you to have a listen to this.
This educational paradigm surrounding Canada's Indigenous people has been built on social Darwinism. The assumption is that non-Indigenous education systems will save these students. And if we can't overcome the lack of funding and the bureaucracy to catch up, then they will assign someone to fix it. What is the likelihood that this person's priority will be maintaining Indigenous identity? The FNEA uses legislation and economic sanctions against an underfunded system. It won't work.
So Chelsea, she mentions funding, but she also says the government will not likely prioritize the preservation of Indigenous identity. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's exactly right. You've got a situation here where you have a system that hasn't been working for quite some time now, and instead of actually dealing with that and not glossing over the fact that funding is a major issue, they're creating sort of a political hot potato where now all of the responsibility is going to be on the shoulders of First Nations, and none of the liability is going to be held by the minister. So the minister has ultimate control and say over everything that happens. But if things go poorly, the fault is now going to be legislated. The fault is going to be on First Nations, not the minister. So there's really there's no incentive here to buy into this. The system is already broken. You're passing it on over. You're not promising any funds in the near future. It's a high likelihood that these systems are going to continue to fail. And what this legislation does is it allows the minister to point at First Nations and say, see, you couldn't fix it. But it doesn't give any actual substantive control to the First Nations to create their own system of education.
I don't think the government's agenda is that nefarious. I really don't. I work with these people, and I can tell you right now, nobody wants the rate of Native dropouts. Nobody wants Native suicides or depression the way it is. Everybody wants to try and resolve it. I assure you there's goodwill all around. The question is, if you give money to people who don't know how to run a school, and I said this earlier, what have you done? You've thrown the money down the drain. I guess the question is, in each case has to be looked at individually. Some reserves have reached the point where they can manage a school, run a school, and turn a good graduation rate. Others, it would be unfair to hand them some money and say, oh, look, you've got to graduate these kids, and you've got to do a good job, and we're going to hold you responsible when they have no basis for doing so. So I think there needs to be some distinction here, too.
I'm just going to play our audience a little clip from the Rapporteur for Indigenous Peoples at the United Nations. His name is James Anaya. He was in Canada last week. He wrapped up his press conference in Ottawa, and he said something very specific about the First Nations Education Reform Act. Have a listen to this.
However, I have heard a remarkably consistent and profound distrust toward the First Nations Education Act being developed by the federal government, and in particular deep concern that the process for developing the Act is not appropriately included nor responded to Aboriginal views. In light of this, I urge the government not to rush forward with this legislation, but to reinitiate discussions with Aboriginal leaders to develop a process and ultimately a bill that addresses Aboriginal concerns and incorporates Aboriginal viewpoints on this fundamental issue.
So Nagarn, there's this sense of not trusting what the government is up to. What's at the root of that?
Well, let's make no bones about it. The federal government completely ignored the special rapporteur's visit to the country as a whole, and I think it's quite ironic that about a week later they then announced the act in absolute, as if there was a response to Mr. Anaya's. I think it's also ironic that the Conservative government, which prides itself on the idea that it's somehow encouraging people to stand up for themselves, then everyone else gets to do that except for First Nations, because they're not able to. They're somehow still the savage beings that they've been for hundreds of years, and they're not good enough to control their own education system. So I find that rather ironic.
I don't know where you get that. I don't know where you get that at all. I don't see that.
Extremely paternalistic.
I read the 32. I read the entire 32-page document, and it says in the document they're going to be consulting, and the very thing you just said, they don't want that. That's what they said.
Well, I think controlling down to the very hiring of teachers, down to the very every aspect of your being has to go through the minister is not in any way supporting for autonomy. That's more bureaucracy, and guess who will be paying for that?
That's
more
not what
money
I read.
away from children.
That's not what I read.
So, gentlemen, as we dispute the interpretation of this, let me just play you one more comment that we got from Bernard Vercourt, and he was saying that talking about a gap in education for Aboriginal students. So he is saying that there is a gap, that it has to be addressed. I'll get to it in a moment. And that if we don't address it, then we're leaving behind a very valuable part of our community. That is a very valid point, Tyrone. How do you address that? How do you address that gap?
About the standards, how are we going to be held to the same standards as provincial government when we're underfunded 20 to 30% lower than what province receives for school programming? So it's not so much about the accountability to First Nations, it's about developing and implementing an education system that suits the students that are attending. Yeah. We built our system because the public system isn't working. Yes, we've got good relationships with the public system, but we also want to develop and maintain our own system. It's all about that local control. That's what it has to be about. Our system has to be about reinstilling our identity through our language, cultures, and histories, incorporated in an education program within an education system. This proposed act takes all of that away. It's going in the wrong direction.
Well, that was not my understanding of the Act. I also read it a couple of times, and First Nations control of First Nations education, that principle was reiterated throughout the document. And so if this becomes law, then it's there. But this has been in effect. It's been policy for many, many years, since 1972.
But
the control and power was there, but the funding was not perhaps to support it. And what I would like to see in the Act is a greater focus on the funding based on the needs of the children and based on the rights of the children to a quality education. But we can't do that if we continue to be all over the place and not willing to come together to work on it. I do believe that the Harper government is sincere in wanting to address this problem.
All right, so Caroline, just take a pause there, Caroline, because we're in the last 2 minutes of this.
Residential schools.
Caroline, take a pause. Please take a breath, because we're in the last 2 minutes of the programme. So, Caroline feels that the government is being sincere. Nigan, do you feel there's sincerity coming from the Stephen Harper government?
Oh, I feel absolutely there's a sincerity to that First Nations can't do the work, so we need to oversee them, control them more, and continue that process.
Tyrone?
It's going in the wrong direction. Like if they did an adequate consultation to actually hear what we had to say and what we had to present, this proposed bill would look differently, because it's obviously didn't listen to us at all, because this proposal looks identical to the blueprint that they rolled out several months ago.
Sure, and the quote that I was trying to find from Bernard Vercourt, the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, was, "This draft legislative proposal is a significant step forward in the spirit of reconciliation in pursuing our shared goal with the First Nations of closing the gaps between First Nations and all Canadians." Significant step forward. Chelsea, yes or no?
Absolutely not. And aspirational comments all you want, but the legislation is clear that this gives absolute control to the minister. And that's not an interpretation. That's in the Act.
Wow. So this is problematic then for what the government does next, whether they are going to go ahead with this draft proposal and then make it an act and then make it a bill. I'm really intrigued to find out what I guess have as a better solution. And I think a great place to take that conversation is to the post show.
Exactly.
At stream.aljazeera.com. Do you have a closing tweet for this
starting
part of the
us off for a little taster for the post, Rachel wants to know, should the schools continue at substandard funding, or should we allow provincial schools to take over our children's education? I know those are the only two options.
Very good question. So, Let's look ahead to see what we're going to be doing on the next show. Crisis in the Central African Republic, a country that the UN says could become the next failed state. There's so many questions about the conflict there, and we will do our best to answer them for you. But stay with us right now. The post show is next at stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching. Hello there, welcome back to the Post Show. We are discussing the state of Canada's Aboriginal education system and what is the best way forward. Let's get right back to the discussion. I want to know the best way forward. I'm hearing everything that you're upset about with perhaps what the Stephen Harper administration is doing, the way they're doing it, problems with the process. What better idea do you have, Chelsea?
Well, I think we need to look at the successes that do exist in Canada, and there are a number of them. We're talking to some people here who come from fairly successful systems. So it's not that there isn't any know-how in Indian country about how to create a good education system for Indigenous peoples that integrates our culture and our languages. Two things that have been identified as very necessary for student success. So, you know, instead of passing this bill and saying, okay, now we have this framework, let's slow down a bit. Let's take a look at the successes and let's actually dialogue with the communities that don't want this act right now because they're not feeling included. Let's have actual dialogue. I think that introducing a bill and then saying we're committed to talking about it is not helpful because it's very top down and we really need a new approach. So let's table it and do something else for now.
Let me just check in to see how realistic that is. Richard, you work with the government. Is that realistic? Slow it down. Let's talk a bit.
That's the legislative process under the Westminster parliamentary system that the Commonwealth runs under. You introduce a bill, and before the third reading, certainly in the first and second reading, there's an opportunity to amend and comment. So I don't know what's so wrong about that. They've actually said in the bill they want commentary.
That hasn't happened with other bills related to First Nations that have been rammed through lately.
They said they want it. I'll take them at their word.
They say it, but they haven't done it with any other piece of legislation that has gone through lately, so I very much doubt it's going to happen here. That's my concern.
Well, Tyrone, I want to bring Tyrone in here because I want him to pick up on something that Chelsea said. She said what's crucial is integrating culture and language. Now on Facebook, Aisha writes in, the issue is that most Native Canadians drop out of school by grade 10. We need a system that is inclusive of their interests and history that includes their input. So is the issue and the fear of losing language, losing heritage, losing that Indigenous culture, are those fears substantiated?
Oh, it's huge. It's one of the reasons we're building our own system here in BC, because kids want to learn about who they are and where they come from, not only in their generation, but generations and generations before. They want to learn why it is they feel so good about being in their homelands, learn about their relationships to the resources and the features within their homelands. So it's all about the kids having the ability to reflect who they are as individuals and as groups in a curriculum, in an education system, because then they feel a part of it. When they're a part of it, they're going to thrive.
So Tyrone, tell us a little bit about that curriculum, because I was studying it, I was reading up on it, and I just thought this is amazing and incredibly beautiful way to keep your kids connected to their roots and their ancestry. But tell us, what's a typical curriculum? What would I learn, say, age 10 about my ancestry if I was in British Columbia and I was First Nation?
It's something we worked on with the province. We created a new English 10, 11, 12 course based on First Nations and other Aboriginal authors. So when we rolled it out we wouldn't call it a pilot, but just rolling it out in earlier stages, we'd go out to the communities to share with the schools what this new curriculum is and the resources behind it. And when we shared the books that the kids be reading in a grade 10 English, and it's a First Peoples English, it's not the public English, although the learning outcomes are equivalent to the academic English 10, the kids were really surprised because the books they would have been reading in school were the same books they're reading at home just through their own enjoyment. So they connected to it right away. So when they picked up that English First Peoples 10, they did really well. So it's about learning not only about the local knowledge from the community basis, it's that broader community, tribal, nation basis as well, and we can do that really well through storytelling.
Caroline,
through literature.
Is this tradition, this heritage, at risk if this Reform Act goes through for the First Nations?
That's absolutely not my understanding, and from what I read, it seems as though it is being supported. It was certainly the message that we sent to the government because we heard it in every community that we visited. The students need to know who they are. To know who they are, they have to know where they come from, and they have to understand their background, their language, their culture. So we felt in our document that it was very important, and I'm seeing indications in the new legislation that that's going to be supported. But here again, the minister is asking for input, from all of us, and this is going to be a missed opportunity if we don't come together and try to improve the bill, because as people have said, the bill is probably going to go through. So this is a small window of opportunity for people to reiterate the fact that language and culture are hugely important.
Caroline, how would you improve it?
I agree with that, and I got to say one thing is that it took us 500 years to get here. Let's be frank. We're not going to fix this thing overnight. This is going to require generational change. We're all frustrated. No one wants to see First Nations people, Aboriginal people, Indigenous people denied an equal opportunity or to receive an education or the right to protect their culture. I think everybody wants that. The question is, how do we get there? And it isn't going to happen overnight.
No, well, I can tell you exactly how it's going to happen because it's already happening within communities that are struggling with the lack of funding to the 67% of the funding that everyone else gets. It's projects like Northern Manitoba that are where people in the community have taken it upon themselves to go and fill in where the schools have not adequately filled in that. And what schools have then done is they've made partnerships within the community now to include teachers that are perhaps not certified by a university. And if you want to know how provinces can get involved, they can become dedicated to the work that First Nations can need. They can consult with them in order to supply them with the appropriately trained teachers. Now, under this legislation, however, it will come under the guise of the minister, who will then decide who will then be included within the school curricula. So, is that a possibility of bettering? I suppose, but under the current history, I really have a fear that the further frustration will continue, and it'll continue this paternalistic and rather controlling aspect of the education system as a whole. It's very unfortunate. I think what Richard and what we see with even in this conversation is a lot of stakeholders who are imposing ideas from outside those communities.
I'm not imposing any idea. I'm not imposing any idea. I just don't want to see your people committing suicide and dropping out of school. I mean, am I imposing something? No, I want your people to be well and whole.
And so the first thing you do is you ask them, and I think Tyrone has indicated time and time again they weren't listened to.
Look,
I'm encouraging involvement. Please get involved. Please make your views known.
All right, so let me go to Chelsea. Chelsea, jump in.
So if you look at positives again, what I think is going to happen here, because this is taking a lot of control away from communities, and they're going to have to fight to get that control back. They're going to have to come up with, they're going to have to renegotiate back into some of the agreements that they already have. This is going to be a huge issue in BC, but also in other areas. What some communities have done, like Ganawage or Akwesasne, is a long time ago, back in the 70s, they took complete control over their education system. They built their own facilities, they created their own curriculum, they negotiated their own agreements with the provinces so that their graduates would be able to go, flow into the provincial system after that. Now, they did that, but these are communities that raised the funds to do it. Not every community has those funds. we keep glossing over the fact that funding is not promised here. And to me, that's a huge issue, because you can't build capacity without funds. Now, I recognize that you had said earlier, you were talking about we can't give money to people who can't run their own systems. Okay, but in these provinces, even if you just go province by province, we have people who are successful that can show their models to other nations.
By all means.
And we can start doing that, but right now it's going to become more difficult. People are going to have to step out of the system and do a lot of the fundraising on their own.
Well, I agree with you.
But when you say
the issue needs to be addressed, and that was one of our key recommendations, that a new formula be negotiated with, significant involvement of Aboriginal and First Nations communities, and that it be predictable and fair and based on the needs of the children. So that is something that I would like to see included in the legislation, because I agree with you on that it's very vague what is mentioned there.
We need to qualify. Sorry, we need to qualify when we're saying that First Nations can't run their own system. In actuality, it's First Nations' inability to run a federal system primarily because it's underfunded.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Where the federal government is holding us accountable to purchase or to provide $100 of education services. They're giving us $70 to do that. And if we have a bake sale and earn $20, they're going to take $20 back. Now the federal government is providing $50 and holding us accountable to run a $100 program. That's really what this is about. The only successful education system that's going to be developed is one that has local control and adequate funding. And both of those are silent in this bill.
So Nigan, you could fill an entire program of all of your grievances about this education proposal. What about your suggestions for the way forward then? How would you make it better?
Well, I mean, the first is what I'd say is that regardless of what this Education Act is going to do, the most empowering thing to me is that First Nations they find a way, they engage it, some First Nations, in spite of the various acts that we are perpetuated against us time and time again. And you're talking to someone who teaches in the system or had taught in the system. And so what I'd say is that the more ability for communities to become empowered to engage and take over their systems in which they know very much about education. They know absolutely what their children need, which is language and culture and experiences and history and politics and all of those things. If you go to a First Nations community today, you could absolutely, they would be a laundry list of things that they would have absolutely certainty of. They know that what their children want to know. Do they have the process and the resources in which to engage that? Absolutely not. That's where the gap is right there. And so simply having now somebody from Ottawa dictating that, deciding on the whim of a pen whether they can determine whether they have a teacher in a community. For instance, somebody who's going to take the students on the land. They do a canoe trip up northern Manitoba here, and they actually learn the processes that it takes to become a self-sustaining individual, not just in terms of hunting and fishing, but as a human being. It's rather absurd to even assume that, and no other community would be under that expectation.
So where would you want the accountability to be? Because there has to be some accountability in an educational system. How would you like that to work?
That's always the argument, isn't it? That First Nations people are always so corrupt they can't handle their own affairs.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, where do you want the accountability?
Absolutely.
Don't do chicken little on me.
The community holds themselves accountable fully and completely. You only have to go to any First Nations to see how they control and hold people to account according to the system. If the system is failing, they're very aware of it more than anyone else.
So Nigan, so here's what I'm seeing here, and it breaks my heart. 50% of Aboriginal young people are not getting out of high school, so it means that the unemployment is going to be really high, the poverty is going to continue, their situation will continue as well. All of these things are not good. So regardless of where the help comes from, does it matter?
By the way, I think
that's not good enough, right? That's not good enough for your future generation of Canadians, whatever their heritage is.
We're actually talking about 60 to 70% in urban areas that are even higher for Indigenous people.
So this is a crisis. I mean, this is really urgent.
Absolutely, because in Manitoba here,
it is.
we're seeing 20% of the labor force, the upcoming labor force, even higher, 40% if you include people like Métis, which are mixed blood people here in Canada. Those people are going to be the labor force. Those are the people who will be put into positions of having to sustain this economy and ensuring that they are the educated and prepared to handle the labor demands of the workforce. I think that is a critically important issue, and there's nobody better equipped to deal with that than First Nations themselves, to understand the ways in which what is needed within their community. Because honestly, if we could fix the poverty situation on First Nations in situations like Attawapiskat, and I could just give a whole laundry list here in Manitoba, that would go forth to engage the real critical issues which are around this country. But unfortunately, keeping those countries within situations of poverty forces them to turn to situations like oil companies to go and mine on their territories, go do fracking on their territories, so then they can fund their schools.
Okay, Nagan, Tyrone, Richard, Caroline, Chelsea, I know you want to carry on talking, but they're going to pull the plug on the internet, and so I'm going to pull the plug before they do, because it's not very interesting looking at a black screen. So thank you for helping us understand this conversation, or at least be part of the conversation. Malika?
I'll give the last word to Sniper Dean on Twitter. He writes in, there's absolutely no reason why Canada's First Nation can't get as good or better education as the rest of us.
Now I have 10 seconds before it all goes black. Let's take a look at what we're doing tomorrow. On tomorrow's programme, crisis in the Central African Republic, as a country that the UN says could become the next failed state. There are so many questions about the conflict there, and we will do our very best to answer them for you. Until then, we'll see you online. Take care.